Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, we will be looking at From Religion to Philosophy by F.M. Cornford. The subtitle, A Study in the Origins of Western Speculation. This book is pretty old school, from 1912. Cornford didn't write an awful lot of books. He wrote a couple, and the ones he wrote, well, I've only read this one, but I think the ones that he wrote were probably pretty good. If this one's any indication, he's got another somewhat major work called Before and After Socrates, which I'm very interested in getting and reading. There's a lot of content in here. I could probably stretch this one out to 2 episodes if I were so inclined. I've decided not to do that. There's a lot of sections I skipped over in discussing some really good stuff toward the end. Good book. It's a good book. If you're interested in Greek mythology and Greek philosophy and the intersection of the two, this is top tier. It's talking about how philosophy first formed. It talks about the earliest philosophers. It talks about Greek religion, and it talks about how religion influenced the earliest philosophy. Something that I think is an important thing to consider when we think about philosophy, as we walk back to like the origins of philosophy. If we walk back to Socrates, what was Socrates all about? I think it's important to understand how, Socrates was executed partly on account of his religious disposition, let's say, or his religious teachings, his introducing new gods into the city. So there's a religious aspect to what was happening with Socrates, and there was a religious aspect to his predecessors and the conversations that were going on in philosophy at the time. That shouldn't be completely ignored. We shouldn't just say, oh, it's the birth of reason, and not think about or understand the fertile soil in which that plant grew. So, like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections out of this one and discuss them. A lot of sections, actually. I have a lot of sections in this book that I want to read. So again, the discussion on this one might be a little bit light as well, same as the last one. But it's just good stuff, and I want to read it to you, and I hope you get out of it what I do. But I will talk about it a little bit, compare it to some of the other books that I've read on the podcast that relate to this. Particularly if you want to kind of lay the groundwork for this episode, you might want to go back and listen to the episode on Friedrich Nietzsche's Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks and Martin Heidegger's Beginning of Western Philosophy. Heidegger talking about Anaximander. You could go back and listen to the episode on Heraclitus, as well as Early Greek Philosophy by John Burnett. That was one that dealt with this as well. Of course, there was Philosophy Before Socrates was an episode that I reviewed. Those are I think the main pre-Socratic episodes that sort of relate to this one. I've also done the episode on The Religion of the Greeks and Romans by Karl Karenyi, and Greek Religion by Walter Burkert. So this has come up a couple times, and I like that because we can dive in a little deeper now that we have laid the groundwork for this type of stuff. So I'm going to read here from when he talks a little bit about Anaximander. We met Anaximander in Heidegger's book and in Nietzsche's book. So here he says, quote, "Philosophical writings of the 6th and 5th centuries were commonly entitled Concerning Nature. Nature, the nature of things, was the name they gave to the one ultimate stuff, from which, as they held, the world of things we see has arisen, and into which it will perish again. It is at once apparent that we have no satisfactory rendering for physis. Primary substance is charged with Aristotelian and scholastic associations. Matter suggests something contrasted with mind or life, whereas the primary meaning of physis is growth, and its first associations are of life and motion, not of stillness and death. The mere use of this term already implies the famous doctrine which has earned for the Milesian school the designation hylozoist, the doctrine that the all is alive. The universe has soul in it, in the same sense, whatever that may be, that there is a soul in the animal body. We must not forget that the meaning of physis, at this stage, is nearer to life than to matter. It is quite as much moving as material, self-moving because alive. Into the earlier pre-scientific history of this living source of all things we must inquire later. For the present, we shall be more concerned with the forms or limits imposed upon its spontaneous activity, the twin conceptions of destiny and law. Thales, the first of the school, identified the living and self-changing world stuff with water. Anaximenes, the third, held that it was air or mist. Anaximander called it the indefinite or limitless thing, apeiron. Anaximander it was who first stated a systematic theory of the nature of the world, not only of the stuff it is made of, but also of the process of its growth out of the limitless thing into the manifold of definite things. We are not concerned with the details, but only with the most general conception of this process of growth, as it is described in what is almost the sole surviving fragment of Anaximander's writings. Things perish into those things out of which they have their birth, according to which it is ordained, for they give reparation to one another and pay the penalty of their injustice according to the disposition of time. Otto Gilbert has explained this utterance as follows. We have to do with three grades of existence. First, there are things, anta, the multiplicity of individual things we see around us. These are declared to perish into those things out of which they came into existence. What then are these secondary things, out of which natural objects came into being? They are the primitive elements of which all bodies are composed: earth, air, water, fire. These elements were recognized long before philosophy began. The visible world groups itself into masses of comparatively homogeneous stuff, each occupying a region of its own. There is first the great lump of earth, above it, and perhaps beneath it also, the waters, then the space of wind and mist and cloud, and beyond that the blazing fire of heaven, the aether. These elements are the secondary stuffs out of which individual things were born and into which they are resolved again. But the elements themselves are not everlasting, nor is the separation of them into distinct regions more than a transient arrangement. They themselves are destined to return into that from which they came, the third and ultimate stage of existence, the limitless thing, which alone is called by Anaximander incorruptible and undying. To sum up the process, the formless, indefinite stuff separates first into the elemental forms distributed in their appointed regions, and then these again give birth to things, and when they die, receive them back again. End quote. Okay, so here we have like some stuff that dips back into the previous episodes. This recalls the Philosophy Before Socrates episode that talked about Empedocles and talked about the elements a little bit more. And it goes back to Anaximander, the Heidegger episode. But it puts it all together a little bit, kind of combines those into three stages where there's the sort of formless, limitless stuff, the indefinite, apeiron of Anaximander, the nameless, that separates itself into four elements, and then those four elements are like the second stage, and then those elements combine themselves in certain ways on account of the motion of the universe into the forms of the things that we see in the world. That's the third stage. So Cornford here is putting together some of the different bits and pieces of sources that we have from ancient Greece and putting together sort of a theory about how the Greek understanding of nature was arranged. And I think that he's probably pretty accurate about how this works here. So moving on from there, he says, quote, "What especially strikes us in Anaximander's statement is that the secular process of birth and perishing is described in moral language. The passing away of things into the elements is called making reparation, paying the penalty of injustice. The words imply that injustice was committed in the very act of their birth into separate existence. The manifold world, in Anaximander's view, can arise only by robbery and misappropriation. Consider, for instance, the animal body. Its proper substance is earth, but for its formation it misappropriates portions of the other elements, water for its blood, air for its breath, fire for warmth. The dissolution of death repays these robberies. Each stolen portion rejoins its like, water to water, air to air, fire to fire. Or take the clouds. To shape them, the air draws water to itself and plunders the rivers and seas. Then the clouds dissolve in rain, which returns to the place of the waters. We see then that the general scheme of the growth of the world is this. The one primary stuff, called nature, is segregated into provinces, each the domain of one element. And this is a moral order, in the sense that transgression of its boundaries, the plundering of one element by another to make an individual thing, is injustice, unrighteousness. The penalty is death and dissolution. No single thing can begin to exist without an infraction of this destined order. Birth is a crime, and growth an aggravated robbery. This is a strange and, to us, a paradoxical view of individual existence. We are disposed to think of the ever-increasing complexity of the world as an intricate order formed out of primitive disorder or chaos. Anaximander may almost be said to reverse this conception. To him, order comes into being not last, but first. The order, namely, which is established when the four elements are sifted by the eternal motion into their distinct regions. If this separation were ever complete, there would be perfect order, and no individual things would exist at all. Every step from that simple disposition of elemental provinces towards the multiplicity of particular things is a breaking of bounds, an advance towards disorder, a declension into the welter of injustice, rape, and war. And every step of this pilgrimage of wrong must be retraced according to what is ordained. In this word are united the conceptions of fate and of right. It means a power which ordains both what must be and what ought to be. This principle of destiny and justice has set the bounds of the original elemental order, and it waits to exact the penalty of every transgression. The power which presides over the physical order is moral." End quote. Okay, so that's he's introducing some strange new concepts into this, and he's questioning the moral aspect of it. Like Anaximander's fragment basically says that, well, let's go back and look at it again. Anaximander's fragment is this: "Things perish into those things out of which they have their birth, according to that which is ordained. For they give reparation to one another and pay the penalty of their injustice according to the disposition of time." Now, this is only one fragment, and so, it's hard to build an entire worldview out of it. But we see there's a moral aspect to what he's saying. They give reparation to one another and pay the penalty of their injustice. So things perish into those things out of which they have their birth. So he says it's odd that there's a moral aspect to this. What can we get from that? Well, things exist by taking on aspects of the various perfect order, the elements in their perfect order. Things sort of churn into chaos, bits and pieces of the elemental division, and mix them up into entities and beings and things in the world. And there's a sort of injustice in everything that exists. by taking from this perfectly divided order into itself in order to exist. And the penalty for this is dissolution, that everything will ultimately be destroyed and dissolved back into the perfectly ordered elemental scheme from which it arose. That's the basic synopsis. So not only are things like given form, but they take their form. They have a sort of guilt in it. They rob from the other things of the world. They rob from the elements, according to Cornford, to acquire the stuff to exist. And the punishment of that is dissolution and death. Okay. So moving on from there, we get a closer look at this concept of fate. Because at the end of the last section, he said the power which presides over the physical order is moral. So this presiding power is fate. So here he says, we turn then from the first philosophers back to the eldest poets of Greece, Homer and Hesiod, in the expectation of finding some representation of the order of the world corresponding to that which we have seen in Anaximander. We are not disappointed. For Anaximander, as we saw, the elements are ordered and assigned to their provinces according to what is ordained, a conception in which necessity and right are united. So in Homer, the gods are subordinate to a remote power, which is both primary, older than the gods themselves, and moral. It is called Moira, destiny. The subjection of the gods to fate is a belief that has passed out of modern thought, or at least taken a quite different form. With the origin of the conception of destiny, we shall be concerned in the next chapter. Our present business is to define the notion at the stage at which we meet with it in Homer. The gods of Homer are limited. They are indeed exempt from age and death, but they are not eternal. They are younger than the world into which they were born. Nor are they almighty, though man is powerless against them. What limits their power, however, is not what we call natural law. On the contrary, miracles are their peculiar function. They are limited by destiny, Moira, which they did not make and against which they cannot stand. The gods cannot save even a man whom they love when the dread fate of death lays hold upon him. Zeus himself laments that it is fate that his son Sarpedon, dearest to him of all men, must die at the hands of Patroclus. He does not venture to undo what fate decrees. It is impossible, even for a god, to avoid the fate that is ordained. What is ordained, says Athena in Euripides, using Anaximander's word, is master of the gods and thee. Prometheus tells the Oceanids that the Moirai and Erinyes hold the tiller of necessity, and that Zeus, if not weaker than they, cannot escape what is decreed by fate. End quote. So here we introduce Moira, or fate, as being superior to the gods, more powerful than the gods, more primordial than the gods, existing before the gods. And this is like what he's been leading up to, of this combination of law and right, or of necessity and right, of fate being like necessity is like ananke, and then right or justice is dikaiosune, or some version of that, daiki. And then combined together, they create a sort of third element or a third entity that is maybe has aspects of each to it, which is fate, Moira, the blending or combination of necessity and right, what must be and what ought to be, as he says. And this is this moral fate, this moral order superior to and prior to the gods. So moving on from there to continue to talk about Moira a little bit, he says, quote, further, as in the Ionian philosopher, so in Homer, the ordinance of fate is not a mere blind and senseless barrier of impossibility. It is a moral decree, the boundary of right and wrong. We may even say that the two notions of destiny and right are hardly distinguished. This comes out in the phrase, beyond what is ordained, beyond fate, which in Homer halts between the two meanings, beyond what is destined and so must be, and beyond what is right and so ought to be. Thus, when the first sense, destiny, is uppermost, it is denied that God or man can make anything happen beyond fate. But elsewhere we find, on the contrary, that things do happen beyond fate. In the Iliad, the Achaeans prevail for a time in battle beyond fate. "Alack," cries Zeus in the Odyssey, "see now how mortal men lay blame upon the gods, for they say it is from us that evil comes, and all the while they themselves, by their own naughtiness, have trouble beyond what is ordained, even as now Aegisthus, beyond what is ordained, has married the wedded wife of the son of Atreus." Here it is evident the moral sense is uppermost. The offenders went beyond, not their fate, but the bounds of morality. Hence, in such cases, the balance is redressed by swiftly following vengeance, which itself is beyond what is ordained in the sense that the sinners brought it upon themselves by their own wickedness, so that they and not fate are responsible. The truest account, perhaps, is that the clear notion of absolute impossibility is wanting in Homer. The adonaton, which we render the impossible, is rather that which lies beyond one's power. It may lie beyond the power even of a god, for, as we have seen, no god is all-powerful. But it is not absolutely and strictly impossible. Power may be stretched for a moment beyond its due and normal limits, so that gods and even men may achieve the impossible. But there is a strong sense that such feats are undesirable and dangerous. For gods and men alike, there are certain destined bounds, which normally and rightly circumscribe their power. It is just possible to exceed them, but only at the cost of provoking an instant nemesis. End quote. So there we see sort of like the boundaries of what is and isn't possible. Like if it's just what must be in all cases at all times, a purely deterministic necessity, how can it have a morality? But then he says, well, it actually can be sort of pushed and people can go beyond what is ordained. They can go beyond fate, beyond what they ought to do. So there is a sort of flexibility, but that becomes a transgression and becomes punishable in the creation of a nemesis. So there can be like pushing beyond the boundaries of what is ordained, but there's a double sense to it. There's also a sense that in some cases gods cannot go beyond what is fated to happen. Gods nor men can go beyond what is fated to happen, but it's almost like they force the fate to expand from a simple doing what must be done to a transgression and a punishment. The creation of a nemesis, the divergence from fate by doing what is beyond fate, beyond what is ordained. So that's interesting. It's the mixture or the blending of the moral and the deterministic. So moving on from there, he says, quote, "If we turn now to the cosmogony of Hesiod, we shall find there that very division of the world into provinces to which we have traced back the original sense of Moira. Further, the supremacy of Moira over the gods is there reflected in a temporal form, that is to say, the separation of the world into elemental provinces is older in time than the birth of the gods. The cosmogony begins with the coming into being of chaos, earth, and eros. Then out of chaos arose darkness and night, and of them were born blazing fire and daylight. This opening act we shall discuss later. Next follows the division of the world into three parts: earth, sky, and sea. Earth, Gaia, first of all gave being to one equal to herself, the starry heaven, Ouranos, that he might enfold her all round, that there might be for the blessed gods a seat secure forever. And she brought forth the high mountains, wherein the gods delight to inhabit. And she gave birth also to the waste ocean, swelling with rage, the sea, Pontos. Here then we find, as a distinct stage in cosmogony, a division of the world into three portions, Moirai, just as in Homer all things were divided in three. And the three provinces were assigned to Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. The starry heaven is for Zeus, the sea for Poseidon. For Hades remains either the misty darkness, that is the air, or the earth, according as it is believed that the dead, whose lord he is, dwell in the western darkness beyond the sunset or underground. The triple division, into the sky, the dry earth, and the sea, takes place, be it noted, without love or the attraction of desire. If it was not, that is to say, an act of marriage and consequent birth, but of division, repulsion, strife, as Empedocles would say. Only afterwards the sundered sky and earth were reunited in marriage by Eros, and of that marriage the eldest gods were born. So Hesiod, by making the triple division older in time than the gods, cosmogony older than theogony, marks by temporal sequence the supremacy of Moira, the dimly personified principle of that division, over the later-born divinities. In Hesiod's view, the gods arose out of the several provinces of nature, the four elements, and those other features of the world, such as mountains and rivers, in which mysterious powers and forces are felt to reside. His prelude ends with an invocation of the Muses, who are to sing of the race of the immortals, born of earth and of the starry heaven, of murky night and of the salt sea. Say how first the gods and earth came into being, and the rivers and the limitless sea, swelling with rage, and the shining stars in the wide heaven above, and the gods that were born out of these, the givers of blessing, how they parted among them their wealth and distributed their honors, and how first they took possession of Olympus. In earth and the fiery heaven, night and the sea, we recognize the four elements. Three of them speak for themselves. The fourth, murky night, evidently represents the air, which the Greeks regularly regarded as dark. Accordingly, when some of the 6th century thinkers, Phyrexides, for instance, or Theognis of Rhegium, equated the elements with the gods, this was no mere play of allegorizing fancy. Some at least of the provinces assigned by Moira to the gods were nothing but these elements, and out of them, as Hesiod very truly says, the gods themselves had come into being. The status of the elements in cosmogony is precisely parallel to the status of the gods in Homeric theology. Both have their appointed regions and departments. Both are subject to Moira. Thus we have found a departmental ordering of the world established in religious representation long before it is affirmed by philosophy. Further, in religion and philosophy alike, this disposition is both primary and moral. The physical order is guarded by the same powers that punish moral transgression, those ministers of justice or Erinyes, the Moirai in their darkest aspect, who, if the sun should overstep his measure, would find him out. This conception of the primary world order is taken over by Anaximander with its main outline unchanged, and above all its moral character unquestioningly retained. The moral aggression of the elements in their perpetual strife is an injustice, an infringement of moral boundaries. So far, the philosophic representation is identical with the religious. Where Anaximander innovates is in making the primary order partly the effect of a mechanical cause, the eternal motion, and in eliminating the gods, whose place is taken by the elements, out of which, according to Hesiod, the gods had arisen. End quote. So that was kind of a long section, but that is the division of the world in Hesiod, where he talks about how in the theogony of Hesiod, we find that in the beginning was chaos and earth and eros, and out of these come the rest of the gods. But at its earliest stages, the first gods are like Nyx, night, darkness, Erebos, chaos. Then comes aether, fire, daylight, heaven, Ornos. The first gods are these like divisions of the universe into its different portions: the sea, the land, the sky, the elements, the fire. And Zeus and the more anthropomorphic like gods that we know of as the Olympians. They were later descendants of these like primordial elemental gods or godlike concepts. They're not as personified at that early level. At least they don't come across that way. But those are the divisions of fate. Those earliest concepts. Although what's interesting is Hesiod doesn't really say like, first came Moira. He basically says that first comes chaos and the divisions. And chaos, obviously, is a little bit different of a concept from fate, from Ananke or from Moira, from order and structure and law and things like that. So yeah, those provinces or divisions that are the initial creations are then doled out to the gods. Zeus, you get this. Poseidon, you get that. So there's a sort of chronological ordering. And he says that when Anaximander comes along, he basically keeps the same story, the same structure, only he even keeps the moral dimension of it. But he's beginning in the philosophical tradition to ascribe the whole thing to a sort of eternal motion, an endless churning motion that causes all of these things to happen. That becomes more important as a source point in philosophy, which I think as a motion moves it back to the deterministic and material from the moral, although the moral is maintained. So let's move on from there. He starts talking about more about how it's a division of geography into sky and land and sea. He says, quote, "Behind the familiar sense of nomos, custom, use, law, lie traces of an older spatial significance, the notion of a range or province, within which defined powers may be legitimately exercised, what the Romans meant by a provincia. This aspect of the idea has become obscured to us owing to the prevalence of the scientific notion of law, which has become associated with causal sequences in time, and has lost its old connection with space. For the understanding of the Greek word, it is necessary to grasp that nomos does not suggest uniformity of temporal sequence, but exercise of power within spatial or departmental boundaries. We must think of law as a dispensation or system of provinces, within which all the activities of a community are parceled out and coordinated. The plural nomoi can mean a social order so constituted, as when, for instance, Pindar speaks of the monstrous child of Ixion and the cloud as having no status among men, nor yet in the social order of the gods. The portentous thing had no proper province in the divine or the human order. It was an outlaw from the classified structure of nature and of society. Or again, when that same poet speaks of the spirit of power of the infant Heracles strangling the snakes in his cradle, the word he uses is eknomios, which we should say preternatural. The half-divine child outranged the normal sphere of an infant's strength. With this conception clearly before us, we may find that it throws some light on two other cognates of nomos and nemine, nemos and nemesis. Nemos, the Latin nemus, is commonly translated by grove, but the word has no etymological connection with trees, and to account for it we must suppose that it did not at first mean simply a natural stretch of woodland. There is reason to believe that a nemos was at first rather a sacred enclosure or clearing in a wood, perhaps a clearing round a sacred tree. Dr. Fraser, dwelling on the practice of tree worship by all the Aryan races of Europe, says, "From an examination of the Teutonic words for temple, Grimm has made it probable that amongst the Germans the oldest sanctuaries were natural woods. However this may be, tree worship is well attested for all the great European families of the Aryan stock. Amongst the Celts, the oak worship of the Druids is familiar to everyone, and their old word for sanctuary seems to be identical in origin and meaning with the Latin nemus, a grove or woodland glade, which still survives in the name of Nemi. Proofs of the prevalence of tree worship in ancient Greece and Italy are abundant." End quote. Okay, so now we start to see this more as a geographical territory. Nomos, custom, use, law, not the way we think of order and law as causally inclined. This happens, then this happens, like the cause and effect sequence that we consider to be like orderly and structural reality, right? Things causes are antecedent to them. We generally think of things in that manner. But the original Nomos was more a dispensation of geography. This place belongs to these people, and this place belongs to these people. That has some sense of Nomos to it. It is the structure of geography, the structure of the world, and the laying out of... But it's not just spatial boundaries. He says spatial and departmental boundaries. So we also see like activities sectioned off to a group of people, another group of activities sectioned to another group of people, an area of thought determined to have some sort of boundaries that contains it, another area of thought has boundaries. It becomes like the establishment of boundaries. The establishment of boundaries being the first creation and imposition of law. And he says both the words Nomos and nemesis. We've talked about nemesis, but also Nomos as a sacred place, which has become used as to describe a grove on account of tree worship and religion among the pagans. So moving on from there to the continuing the transition from philosophy to, or from religion to philosophy, he says, quote, "How does the cosmology of Anaximander differ from the cosmology of Homer or of Hesiod? We have seen that the philosopher and the poets have the same fundamental scheme in common. Why do we call Anaximander's treatment philosophic or scientific, and Hesiod's religious or mythical? One obvious difference is that Anaximander has expurgated the supernatural with a boldness and completeness to which many of his successors failed to attain. To be more precise, he has expurgated those features and factors, the supernatural or mythical character of which he was able to detect. He has eliminated Zeus and his fellow Olympians, and in so doing has struck out of his scheme of things the objects on which the religious consciousness of his time was, whether in name or reality, focused. The effect, as we have seen, is that he restores the more ancient reign of Moira. The primary order is still said to be according to what is ordained. It is still a moral order in which justice prevails, but the will of the personal God has disappeared, and its place is partly taken by a natural cause, the eternal motion. We seem to have left the supernatural behind, and to have passed at one step into the shining air of reason. The Milesian school strikes a new note, unheard before. It has a fresh sense of the meaning of truth, a feeling for what might or might not be literally and prosaically true, and for the sort of thing it is reasonable to suppose. The hypothesis it characteristically deals in is concerned with the nature of the one primary stuff, and although we may be able to see that about this entity there still clung much that was of mythical origin, the Milesians seem to make a great conscious effort to get at something which really does exist. They strike us as throwing off the vast symbolic visions of mythology and waking, clear-headed, to see and touch real things. If we have a rational temperament, we feel at once a refreshment. Here at last is a statement about the world which is meant and offered as true, a logos, not a mythos. It is perhaps the sudden pleasantness of this change of air that has caused us to draw too hard a line between religion and philosophy, and either to overlook the persistence of fundamental conceptions, or to follow the matter-of-fact peripatetic tradition and wave them aside as poetical metaphors. We may easily attach more importance than it deserves to the disappearance of the Olympians from the framework of the world, and suppose that, when they went, they took with them the whole element of the mythical or supernatural. That is by no means true. Homer's gods had drifted so far out of touch with nature and with the demands of human morality that any man of intellect like Anaximander could run a pen through them and leave the world and the heart of man none the poorer. They had grown so personal and individual and human that nothing but a wide freedom of allegorical interpretation could keep the old idols on their bases. But when the gods were eliminated, a moral or sacred character still clung to the framework of the world itself, that system of provinces within which the gods had sprung up and developed, till they were overblown and died. The stuff of the world, the Physis, portioned out into those provinces, was also, as we shall see, a conception of mythical origin. In other words, when Anaximander thought he was getting to close quarters with nature, this nature was not simply the outer world presented to us through our senses, but a representation of the world order, actually more primitive than the gods themselves. This representation was, moreover, of a religious character. It was taken over by philosophy from religion, not independently deduced from observation of the world and its natural processes." End quote. Okay, so that's cool because he's saying, all right, so the difference here between Homer and Hesiod and Anaximander, why is one philosophy and one mythical? And he says, well, he's kind of leaving the Olympian gods behind. He's not looking to the Olympian gods for the reason of, why and how things happen. He's trying to say something that is true, and he says this is a logos and not a mythos. He's trying to make a statement based on the motion of the world, like I said, something about how things actually are that doesn't automatically rely on the gods and the story to support it. It's maybe more observation-based, and it's a theory about what's going on that sort of breaks the bounds of what has already been said. It's looking in a new direction to get at what's true. And so for that reason, we've drawn this line and said, oh, they broke away from religion and they created something new, and this is like the birth of reason and the death of the ancient mythology. But he says that actually what Anaximander and the early philosophers found when they sort of let the Olympians take a back seat or slip from the scene was an older division of the world and an older supernatural, older moral, older mythological order, the order of fate, the order of Moira, the order of the division of the elements, and the most ancient gods. And they were actually drawing on a really old and ancient tradition when the philosophers first sort of uncovered this way of seeing the world. So, moving on from there, he says, quote, "It would perhaps be generally assumed that to think of the world as moral through and through, as a kingdom of justice, belongs to a late period of reflection. The assumption hangs together with that picture we drew at the outset, of the individual philosopher examining his inner and outer experience and drawing well-considered deductions from what he observed. It would be long indeed before anything presented to his unbiased perceptions would lead him to suppose that nature had any respect whatever for moral standards. Wherever and whenever a professed man of science upholds such an opinion, we may be certain that he is not formulating a description of observed facts, but turning his knowledge to the defense of a belief which he has learnt, not direct from nature, but at his mother's knee. In other words, a collective representation. And this particular representation is not the outcome of long accumulated results of science and philosophy. On the contrary, the further back we trace it, the more firmly planted it appears, and the daily contradiction of all experience has not yet uprooted it from the popular mind. The term collective representation has been made familiar to us by the modern French school of sociologists. It is roughly defined by one of them as follows. Representations called collective can be recognized by the following marks. They are common to the members of a given social group, within which they are transmitted from generation to generation. They are imposed upon the individuals and awaken in them, as the case may be, feelings of respect, fear, adoration, etc. toward their objects. They do not depend for their existence upon the individual, not that they imply a collective subject distinct from the individuals composing the social group, but in that they present themselves with characters, which cannot be accounted for merely by considering the individuals as such. It is thus that a language, although properly speaking, it exists only in the minds of the individuals who speak it. It is nonetheless indubitably a social thing, founded on a mass of collective representations. It imposes itself on each of the individuals, it exists before each of them and survives him. But it may be objected, are we not here denying what we before admitted, that particular liberty of Greek thought from dogmatic imposition, which made possible the free development of ancient speculation? To meet this object and define our meaning, we must make the notion of a collective representation, insofar as it concerns our subject, more precise. We do not mean that the Greek philosopher, at any rate in Ionia, was compelled by society to profess his belief that Zeus sat on a throne somewhere in the sky and controlled the course of natural events, or that he was liable to be burnt alive if he publicly denied that the sun goes round the earth. Such persecution, though it is not unknown in the pre-Christian world, was in the main characteristic of later ages, and of religions which claimed to be universal. It was possible for a Greek to dispense with the supernatural, and even openly to attack the morality and existence of the gods of popular belief, Xenophanes of Colophon, who criticized Homeric theology with unsparing plainness, lived to a good old age. The philosopher was not in this sense trammeled by dogma, and when we speak of collective representation, it is not dogma, a formulated creed or collection of final truths about the world and its governance that we mean. But when we have eliminated all such formulas and creeds and put aside the supernatural, there remains embedded in the very substance of all our thoughts about the world and about ourselves an inalienable and ineradicable framework of conception, which is not of our own making, but given to us ready-made by society, a whole apparatus of concepts and categories, within which, and by means of which, all our individual thinking, however original and daring, is compelled to move. This common inherited scheme of conception, which is all around us and comes to us as naturally and unobjectionably as our native air, is nonetheless imposed upon us and limits our intellectual movements in countless ways. All the more surely and irresistibly because, being inherent in the very language we must use to express the simplest meaning, it is adopted and assimilated before we can so much as begin to think for ourselves at all. This mass of collective representation is, of course, constantly ongoing gradual change, largely due to the critical efforts of individual thinkers who from time to time succeed in introducing profound modifications. It is different for every age in history, for every well-marked group in the intellectual chart of mankind, and even within such groups, in a minor degree, for every nationality. Hence the error of supposing that human nature is much the same at all times, and that since non-human nature is much the same too, the Greek philosopher of the 6th century BC, studying his inner and outer experience, was confronted with the same problems seen in the same light as the English philosopher of today. The difference, the immense difference, between the two lies in their several inheritances of collective representation. It is a difference that comes home to anyone who has to translate, as it is called, from Greek into English. He will soon discover that, when once we go beyond the names of objects like tables or trees, and of simple actions such as running or eating, no Greek word has an exact equivalent in English. No important abstract concept covers the same area, or carries with it the same atmosphere of association. Translation from one language to another is impossible, from an ancient to a modern language, grotesquely impossible, because of these profound differences of collective representation, which no translation will ever transfer. End quote. So that we start stepping out of the ancient Greek world a little bit and into the modern world with the discussion of collective representations. And he really says that any thought of the world as moral, he says, from the beginning here, it would be generally assumed that to think of the world as moral through and through, as a kingdom of justice, belongs to a late period of reflection, and that comes about as a result of these collective representations that people get from their societies, from their parents. He says if a scientist or someone is proposing that nature has a respect for moral standards or some moral aspect, we know that person is speaking in terms of their collective representation. He says, we may be certain, he says, whenever and wherever a professed man of science upholds such an opinion, this is the opinion that nature has respect for moral standards. We can be certain he's not formulating a description of observed facts, but turning his knowledge to the defense of a belief which he has learned, not directly from nature, but at his mother's knee, a collective representation. So our concepts of nature as moral and our concepts of morality in general are built out of collective representation. It's not something that we directly observe from nature. It's something that is a part of our societies. He says this is, according to this French guy he quotes, this is common to the members of social groups, transmitted from generation to generation and imposed upon the individuals. And they don't depend on the individuals, but they imply a collective subject distinct from the individuals. A sort of social entity, if you will, of a culture having its own, almost a life of its own, that's not dependent upon any of the individuals, not deliberately, consciously created by any of the individuals within it, but that exists as its own thing, comprised of the contributions of a whole range of individuals. And we can't really understand the Greeks because they had their own set of collective representations. And when these philosophers stripped away Zeus and everything else, like, they had a sort of freedom to criticize the gods and to think differently about the gods. They weren't as dogmatic. And when they stripped away the gods and they stripped away the supernatural, they were still always left with a sense of morality that was built into their collective representations. And we can't really translate them. We don't have the same collective representations today, and all we can do is try and sort of consciously understand or formulate, or maybe even intuitively try to understand or formulate what the collective representations of the ancient Greeks were like. And we can try to understand that through their language and their mythology. So talking a little bit more about fate in society, he says, quote, "How did it come about, in the first instance, that the disposition of the cosmos and of its parts was charged with those tremendous emotions which enforce human custom or morality? How did it come to be a religious or moral representation at all? We think we understand why positive laws of conduct are still enforced by these emotions. If we were called upon to defend them, we should urge that, in the main, they correspond to practical interests at all times important for the existence or well-being of socialized humanity. But why should the same emotional sanction ever have become attached to beliefs about the order and structure of non-human nature? And this so firmly that even when religion has decayed, it was long before science could vindicate them for her own domain, in which no belief is sacred and all emotion save curiosity is out of place. When the question is thrown into this shape, the answer lies near at hand. It is this: Moira came to be supreme in nature over all the subordinate wills of men and gods because she was first supreme in human society, which was continuous with nature. Here too we find the ultimate reason why destiny is moral. She defines the limits of mores, of social custom. This continuity of the order of nature with the grouping of society, foreign as it is to our modern ways of thinking, is abundantly evidenced from the various parts of the world where we shall find that the social structure is used as a framework into which all classes of natural phenomena are fitted." End quote. So he says really that Moira and fate is a social representation first and foremost. It's a social concept that enforces morality upon society and is then drawn out onto nature because we find that nature and our societies have a correspondence with one another. So looking at that definition again, he says, Moira came to be supreme in nature over all the subordinate wills of men and gods because she was first supreme in human society, which was continuous with nature. Okay, human society is continuous with nature. And that is like, why there's always the question of where Physis ends and Nomos begins. Because society and nature are continuous with one another. And Moira was born, so to speak, as human society structured, and that's kind of what makes a society. Laws and customs and departmentalization and boundaries, the existence of boundaries, and law and order was sort of psychologically, let's say, imposed or recognized in nature as moral because of the moral order that existed in humanity in order to make us social beings. That seems to be my understanding of what he's saying there. So moving on, he talks a little bit more about morality and structure of society. He says, quote, "Here we touch at last the bedrock. Behind philosophy lay religion. Behind religion, as we now see, lies social custom, the structure and institutions of the human group. In the first chapter, we divined that Moira, the supreme power in the universe, was very closely allied to Nomos, in the sense of constitutional order. Now it appears that Moira is simply a projection or extension of Nomos, from the tribal group to the elemental grouping of the cosmos. We can read a new sense into the apophthegm ascribed to Pythagoras, that Themis in the realm of Zeus and Dike in the world below hold the same place and rank as Nomos in the cities of men, so that he who does not justly perform his appointed duty may appear as a violator of the whole order of the universe. The eternal laws, of which Antigone said that no one knew from whence they were proclaimed, can now be seen to have been projected, as a sort of Brockenspectre, from those very laws of the state with which she contrasts them. We are now in a position to formulate the answer to our main question, as follows. Primitive beliefs about the nature of the world were sacred, religious, or moral beliefs, and the structure of the world was itself a moral or sacred order, because, in certain early phases of social development, the structure and behavior of the world were held to be continuous with, a mere extension or projection of, the structure and behavior of human society. The human group and the departments of nature surrounding it were unified in one solid fabric of Moira, one comprehensive system of custom and taboo. The divisions of nature were limited by moral boundaries because they were actually the same as the divisions of society. End quote. So again, we see that there's a moral order of Nomos that is continuous with nature, Physis, and again, the distinctions of nature, the structure of nature is a projection of the structure of human society. Thus we see that there are kings of gods, there are gods that have power over certain domains of human activity. And let's pick up this last section here. He discusses the primacy of the group. He says, quote, "We have dwelt on these details with a view to making it clear that in a society so organized, the unit is the group, not the individual. And whether or no the ancestors of the Greeks had a developed totemic system, we may be certain that, the further we go back into the prehistoric past of any race of mankind, the less the individual will count and the more his social group, however it may be defined, will be the unitary factor. As evidence of this, survivals are not wanting among the Greeks. Pindar makes us familiar with the daemon or genius of a clan, to whom, rather than to the individual competitor, the glory of success in the great games is ascribed in so many of his odes of victory. In the tragedians, especially Aeschylus, we encounter the notion of hereditary guilt, of those taints and troubles which, arising from some ancient wrath, existed in certain families, and were transmitted with the blood to the ruin of one descendant after another, who, in the view of a later individualistic morality, were personally innocent. These and other such representations illustrate the persistence of the moral solidarity of the group. We may note, too, the implication of this solidarity, namely that the circumference of the group is, so to say, the moral frontier. Inside that frontier, the group as a whole has its proper duties, exercised in common, and its collective rights diffused over the whole area. Outside the frontier are other groups, equally coherent and internally undistinguished, and this frontier is the surface at which moral friction occurs. Society, in a word, is a system of Moira, and the boundaries of its groups are also the boundaries of morality. Within them lies Nomos, all that you ought to do and must do, the exercise of the group functions, the expression of its peculiar magical powers. Beyond them lies all you must not do, all that is taboo. The sentinel at the frontier is death. It may be significant that Moira is the counterpart of Moros, death, and that the word Moira itself easily passes from its sense of allotted portion to mean doom, the grievous doom of death. End quote. So, again, with the boundaries, Moira, fate, what you must do, Nomos, the society, the bonds of society, the collectiveness, the groupishness of people, and the taboo, and how all those things are necessary for societies to exist. These are the structural elements of societies. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.